Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Now I know what you might be thinking. FT, another list video, really? But trust me, this isn't your average top 10 cutest cat videos. No, this one is a bit heavier. It's a story about power, about promises, and unfortunately about betrayal. Today, we're counting down the top 10 politicians who sold Africa to foreign powers. And when I say sold, I don't mean they put a for sale sign on the Serengeti. It's more complex, more insidious than that. It's about deals made in smoke-filled rooms, resources traded for personal fortunes, and sovereignty exchanged for a seat at a table that was never meant for them. These weren't just bad business deals, they were decisions that mortgaged the future of entire nations. We're talking about actions that didn't just affect the economy for a fiscal quarter, they echoed through generations, shaping the very fabric of societies, fueling conflicts, and creating cycles of debt and dependency that the continent is still struggling to break free from today. It's a story of how the immense wealth of a continent, its minerals, its land, its very people, was bartered away, often by the very leaders who swore an oath to protect it. So grab a seat, because this is important. Understanding this history isn't about pointing fingers or dwelling on the past, it's about understanding the present. It's about seeing how these historical handshakes and backroom deals have drawn the lines on the maps we see today, both literally and figuratively. It's a complicated, often painful journey, but it's one we need to take to understand the Africa of today and the potential of the Africa of tomorrow. Let's get into it. Alright, let's kick things off with a name that, for many, is the very definition of colonialism: Cecil Rhodes. Now technically, was he an African politician? No. But was he a politician who fundamentally sold out parts of Africa for a foreign power? Absolutely. You can't talk about this topic without starting here. Rhodes was a British businessman, a mining magnate, and the Prime Minister of the Cape Colony in the late 19th century. His ambition wasn't just to get rich, it was to paint the map of Africa red, from Cape to Cairo, under the British flag. His vehicle for this was the British South Africa Company. This wasn't just a company, it was a private enterprise with the power of a state. Rhodes got a royal charter from Queen Victoria which basically gave him a license to invade, conquer, and rule vast territories in South-Central Africa. He used deception and brute force to get what he wanted. He famously tricked King Lobengula of the Ndebele people into signing the Rudd Concession, a document that the king believed only granted mining rights but was twisted to claim sovereignty over his entire kingdom. This act of fraudulent diplomacy was the foundation for the creation of Rhodesia, a country literally named after him, which we now know as Zimbabwe and Zambia. His policies were designed not for the benefit of the African people who lived there, but for the enrichment of the British Empire and his own shareholders. He implemented land and labor policies that dispossessed Africans of their ancestral lands, forcing them into a system of cheap labor for his mines and farms. This wasn't a partnership, it was a hostile takeover. The legacy of Rhodes is one of systematic exploitation. He laid the legislative and economic groundwork for apartheid in South Africa. The Glen Grey Act of 1894, for instance, pushed black Africans off their land to create a pool of industrial workers. He saw the continent and its people not as a place to be understood or collaborated with, but as a resource to be extracted, a chessboard for his imperial games. He didn't just sell out a piece of Africa, he engineered the very system that allowed others to do it for a century to come. So, while he wasn't African, his political maneuvering in Africa set a dangerous and devastating precedent. He created a template for how foreign interests could, through a combination of corporate power, political cunning, and military might, co-opt and control African territories for their own gain. His actions weren't a simple sale. They were the drawing of a blueprint for continental exploitation, making him an unavoidable and infamous figure at the start of our list. If Cecil Rhodes wrote the blueprint for corporate colonialism, then our next figure, King Leopold II of Belgium, perfected the art of personal greed on a continental scale. And when I say personal, I mean it. The Congo Free State, an area 76 times the size of Belgium, wasn't a Belgian colony. No, it was Leopold's private property, his personal fiefdom. He convinced the world at the Berlin Conference of 1884 that his intentions were purely humanitarian, to end the slave trade and bring civilization to the Congo. It was one of the biggest, most tragic lies in history. What he actually did was turn the entire region into a massive forced labor camp. His goal was rubber and ivory, and he was willing to do anything to get it. His private army, the Force Publique, terrorized the local population into meeting impossibly high quotas. Villages were given targets, and the punishment for failing to meet them was mutilation or death. The images from this era are the stuff of nightmares, men, women and children with their hands and feet severed as proof that bullets hadn't been wasted. This wasn't governance. It was systematic terror for profit. The wealth extracted from the Congo flowed directly into Leopold's pockets, funding lavish public works projects back in Brussels, earning him the nickname, the Builder King. Meanwhile, the population of the Congo was decimated. Historians estimate that as many as 10 million people, perhaps half the population, died from the violence, the starvation, and the disease that ran rampant under his brutal regime. It was a holocaust driven by the demand for rubber for bicycle tires and industrial machinery in the West. Leopold's humanitarian project was a sham, a veil to hide an operation of pure plunder. He sold the entire concept of the Congo to the world as a philanthropic enterprise, while in reality, he was selling its resources, its people, and its future to fuel his own immense fortune. He created a system so brutal, so depraved, that it eventually sparked one of the world's first major international human rights campaigns. The outcry became so loud that he was forced to hand over control of the Congo to the Belgian state in 1908, but the damage was done. The legacy of Leopold's rule is a deep, open wound in the heart of Africa. He didn't just exploit the Congo, he shattered its societies, erased its histories, and instilled a pattern of violent extraction that would haunt the nation for generations to come. He wasn't a politician governing a state, he was a monster presiding over an abattoir, all under the guise of progress and philanthropy, making him one of history's most notorious villains. After the horrors of Leopold and the subsequent decades of Belgian colonial rule, you would hope the story of the Congo, now renamed Zaire, would get better. It didn't. It just got a new leading man, Mobutu Sese Seko. Mobutu seized power in a 1965 coup, and for the next 32 years, he ruled Zaire as his personal piggy bank with the full backing of the West. Why? Because it was the Cold War and Mobutu was their guy, a staunch anti-communist bulwark in the heart of Africa. Mobutu perfected the art of the deal, but the deals were always for him, never for his people. He nationalized the country's vast mineral resources, particularly the copper mines, under a policy he called Zaireanization. But this wasn't about empowering the Congolese people. It was about transferring wealth from foreign corporations directly into his own hands and the hands of his cronies. He became one of the richest men in the world, with a personal fortune estimated in the billions, while his country crumbled. He was the master of playing foreign powers against each other. He courted the United States, France, and Belgium, receiving immense financial and military aid in return for his loyalty, and more importantly, for unrestricted access to Zaire's strategic resources like cobalt, crucial for the arms industry. He would fly to Paris in a chartered Concorde for shopping sprees. He built a lavish Versailles in the jungle for himself, while roads, schools, and hospitals decayed into non-existence. The country had a saying, "The state pretends to pay us, and we pretend to work." Mobutu didn't just sell resources, he sold the state itself. The government became an instrument of theft, a system so corrupt it was given its own name, kleptocracy, or rule by thieves. He would famously tell his people, "If you want to steal, steal a little cleverly, in a nice way. Only if you steal so much as to become rich overnight, you will be caught." This was coming from the leader of the country. He was essentially giving lessons in corruption while running the masterclass. When the Cold War ended, Mobutu's usefulness to the West evaporated, his support dried up, and his rotten regime quickly collapsed in 1997. He left behind a country hollowed out by decades of systematic plunder, a nation rich in resources but populated by some of the poorest people on earth. He is the ultimate example of a post-colonial leader who didn't just collaborate with foreign powers, but mimicked and even surpassed the extractive greed of his colonial predecessors, all for personal gain. Now we move south to Zimbabwe into a figure who is, honestly, incredibly complex and controversial, Robert Mugabe. He began his political life as a celebrated liberation hero, a revolutionary who fought against white minority rule in Rhodesia and brought independence to his people in 1980. For many, he was a symbol of hope, an educated, articulate leader who promised a new dawn of equality and prosperity for Zimbabwe. The first decade of his rule, in fact, saw significant gains in health and education, but, well, the story took a dark turn. The promises of liberation soured into a desperate and often violent struggle to maintain power. A key part of this was his relationship with the land and with foreign partners. The land issue was always central. At independence, most of the country's best farmland was owned by a small number of white farmers. The initial willing buyer, willing seller model for land reform, backed by Britain, was slow and honestly, pretty inadequate. The turning point came in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Facing growing political opposition, Mugabe launched a fast-track land reform program. This wasn't a carefully planned redistribution, it was often chaotic and violent, with war veterans and youth militias seizing white-owned farms. While the principle of returning land to the people resonated with many, the execution was disastrous. It crippled the country's agricultural backbone, once known as the breadbasket of Africa, leading to economic collapse and hyperinflation. In the midst of this economic chaos, Mugabe pivoted. Ostracized by the West, he adopted a look-east policy, forging deep ties with countries like China and Malaysia. These weren't partnerships of equals. Zimbabwe offered up its vast mineral wealth, diamonds, platinum, gold, in exchange for political support, arms, and infrastructure projects that, more often than not, benefited the ruling elite rather than the general population. Controversial deals were struck, particularly in the Marange diamond fields, where the military was implicated in human rights abuses, and the nation's diamond wealth vanished into a web of opaque joint ventures with foreign companies. Mugabe's story is, without a doubt, a tragedy. A leader who started with so much promise ended up presiding over the destruction of his own country's economy. He sold off future mineral revenues and entered into lopsided partnerships to prop up his political power. The man who fought to reclaim the land for his people ultimately oversaw a process that impoverished them. He traded long-term national prosperity for short-term political survival, leaving behind a legacy of economic ruin and a stark warning about how the ideals of liberation can be corrupted by the thirst for power. Let's travel to the Horn of Africa, to Ethiopia, and a man whose name, honestly, is synonymous with a period of intense political violence. Mengistu Haile Mariam. Mengistu was a military officer who came to power after the overthrow of Emperor Haile Selassie in 1974. He established a brutal Marxist-Leninist military junta called the Derg. His mission was to transform Ethiopia into a socialist state, and he was willing to use any means necessary. This led to the Red Terror, a campaign of horrifying violence where tens of thousands of political opponents were imprisoned, tortured, and executed. But you see, a reign of terror is expensive to maintain, especially when you're also fighting multiple civil wars and a war with neighboring Somalia. Mengistu needed powerful friends, and he found them in the Eastern Bloc. He aligned Ethiopia firmly with the Soviet Union and its allies. In exchange for geopolitical loyalty in a crucial region, the Soviets poured in billions of dollars worth of military hardware. We're talking tanks, fighter jets, and an arsenal of weapons that made Ethiopia's army one of the largest in sub-Saharan Africa. This alliance wasn't about developing Ethiopia, it was about militarizing it. The country's resources were funneled not into feeding its people or building its economy, but into prosecuting Mengistu's wars. This had catastrophic consequences. While the government was spending a fortune on Soviet arms, the country was hit by one of the worst famines in modern history in the mid-1980s. The images of starving children shocked the world and inspired the We Are the World charity single. The tragic irony was that Mengistu's government was actively making the famine worse. It used the denial of food aid as a weapon against rebel-held areas and spent its resources on a massive forced resettlement program that caused the deaths of tens of thousands more. He sold his country's alignment and strategic position to the Soviet Union, not for the betterment of his people, but to acquire the tools of repression and warfare he needed to cling to power. The price of those guns was paid in human lives. When the Soviet Union began to collapse in the late 1980s, Mengistu's main lifeline was cut. His regime, deprived of its foreign military support, quickly crumbled, and he fled into exile in 1991, finding refuge in Zimbabwe, hosted by his friend Robert Mugabe. He left behind a country traumatized by war, famine, and political violence, a stark example of a leader who mortgaged his nation's well-being and sacrificed his own people for a foreign ideology and the military hardware to enforce it. Our journey now takes us to Sudan, a country that for 3 decades was under the iron fist of Omar al-Bashir. Bashir seized power in a military coup in 1989 and quickly imposed a hardline Islamist regime. His rule was defined by conflict, a long and brutal civil war with the South, which eventually led to the independence of South Sudan, and the horrific conflict in Darfur, which the United States and others labeled a genocide. To wage these wars and survive international sanctions, Bashir needed a powerful non-Western ally. He found one in China. The relationship was built on a simple, powerful commodity oil. Sudan had vast, untapped oil reserves, and China had a voracious, fast-growing economy that needed fuel. While Western companies were hesitant to invest due to sanctions and the ongoing conflicts, China's state-owned oil companies stepped in with a no-strings-attached policy. They built the pipelines, the refineries, and the export terminals, and in return, the oil flowed east. For a time, Sudan was one of China's biggest sources of foreign oil. This oil money became the lifeblood of Bashir's regime. It funded his military, allowing him to prosecute the war in Darfur and suppress dissent across the country. The partnership was a classic case of mutual benefit for the elites. Bashir got the cash and political cover he needed to stay in power, and China got the resources it needed to power its growth. The Sudanese people, particularly those in the conflict zones, paid the price. The oil wealth was rarely invested in development, healthcare, or education for the masses. Bashir became an international pariah, indicted by the International Criminal Court for genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity in Darfur. Yet he was able to travel freely to friendly countries and remain in power for years, partly thanks to the political and economic shield provided by his foreign partners. He wasn't just selling oil, he was selling impunity. He traded his country's natural resources for the means to wage war against his own people and defy international justice. His 30-year rule finally ended in 2019 after months of popular protests. He left behind a country fractured by war, economically crippled despite its oil wealth, and facing a deeply uncertain future. The story of Omar al-Bashir is a modern cautionary tale of how a pariah state can survive by selling its resources to a global power that prioritizes economic needs over human rights, creating a partnership that enriches and empowers a brutal regime at a terrible human cost. Let's head north to Egypt, a country that has for millennia been a crossroads of civilizations and a prize for empires. For 30 years, from 1981 to 2011, it was led by Hosni Mubarak. Mubarak came to power after the assassination of Anwar Sadat, and he established a regime built on one core principle: stability. But it was the stability of stagnation, maintained by a powerful security state and, crucially, massive support from the West, particularly the United States. Mubarak's deal was simple. In exchange for upholding the peace treaty with Israel, acting as a key partner in the so-called War on Terror, and ensuring the smooth passage of ships through the Suez Canal, Egypt would receive billions of dollars in aid every year. For decades, Egypt was the second largest recipient of U.S. foreign aid after Israel, with most of it being military assistance. This aid propped up Mubarak's authoritarian rule, funding the very police and military forces that were used to suppress dissent and maintain his grip on power. This wasn't a sale of oil or diamonds, but something more subtle: the sale of geopolitical alignment. Mubarak positioned Egypt as the indispensable Arab ally for the West. He was the reliable strongman, the buffer against Islamism, the guarantor of regional stability. In return, Western powers largely turned a blind eye to the rampant corruption, the lack of democracy, the police brutality, and the rigged elections that characterized his rule. The economic policies under Mubarak also favored foreign interests and a small, connected local elite. His government embraced neoliberal reforms pushed by the IMF and World Bank, privatizing state-owned enterprises in deals that were often less than transparent and led to massive wealth accumulation for his family and their cronies. Meanwhile, ordinary Egyptians faced rising inequality, unemployment, and a sense of hopelessness. The benefits of this strategic partnership rarely trickled down. The arrangement came to a dramatic end in 2011. Inspired by the revolution in Tunisia, millions of Egyptians poured into Tahrir Square, demanding an end to his rule. The very stability he had sold to the West for 30 years crumbled in just 18 days. Mubarak's downfall showed the hollowness of a leadership built not on popular legitimacy, but on a transactional relationship with foreign powers. He had secured his own power by making Egypt a client state, but in doing so, he alienated the very people he was supposed to lead. Now we travel to West Africa, to Côte d'Ivoire, and its founding father Félix Houphouët-Boigny. He led his country to independence from France in 1960 and ruled for 33 years until his death. Unlike many of his contemporaries who embraced nationalism and socialism, Houphouët-Boigny took a completely different path. He believed his country's future was inextricably linked to its former colonial ruler France. He became the architect and chief proponent of what is known as Françafrique. Françafrique was an intricate, often shadowy network of personal, political, and economic ties that kept many French-speaking African nations firmly within France's sphere of influence long after independence. Houphouët-Boigny was its linchpin. He maintained incredibly close relationships with a succession of French presidents, offering political loyalty and preferential treatment for French businesses in exchange for French military protection and development aid. Under his rule, Côte d'Ivoire experienced an economic miracle for a time, becoming a major exporter of coffee and cocoa. French companies dominated key sectors of the Ivorian economy, from construction to transport to utilities. The country's currency, the CFA franc, was pegged to the French franc, a system that provided monetary stability but also limited economic sovereignty, with a portion of the country's foreign reserves held in the French treasury. This arrangement ensured that economic power remained heavily tilted towards Paris. Houphouët-Boigny's pro-French stance made him a key Western ally during the Cold War. He was a vocal anti-communist and allowed France to maintain a significant military base in his country, giving them a strategic foothold in the region. He famously said, "The hen is not to be embarrassed when the cock is around." For him, France was the cock whose protection was essential. This loyalty came at a price, creating a deep dependency and a political culture where French approval was often seen as more important than popular support at home. While his policies brought a period of stability and prosperity, they also created a system that was deeply unequal and ultimately fragile. The wealth was concentrated, and the political system was built around his personality and his foreign connections. After his death in 1993, the deep ethnic and political fault lines he had papered over with French-backed prosperity cracked wide open, plunging the country into years of instability and civil war. He built a nation that was more of a subsidiary of France than a truly independent state. Let's return to Ethiopia and go back in time, before the Derg, to the reign of the last emperor, Haile Selassie. He is a figure of immense global stature, a symbol of African independence for many, revered by the Rastafari movement as a divine being. He famously stood before the League of Nations in 1936 to plead for help against Mussolini's fascist invasion, becoming a powerful voice against appeasement. But the story of his long rule is also one of complex and sometimes desperate diplomacy that involved significant concessions to foreign powers. Selassie's primary goal was to preserve Ethiopia's ancient sovereignty in a world of encroaching colonial powers. To do this, he had to play a delicate balancing act. Before the Italian invasion, he made overtures and signed treaties with various European nations, including Italy itself, in an attempt to modernize his country and secure its borders through diplomacy. These were the chess moves of a leader trying to navigate the treacherous waters of 20th century geopolitics with a weak hand. The real compromises came after World War II, when he was restored to his throne with the help of the British. To consolidate his power and modernize his military, he turned to the United States. During the Cold War, Ethiopia became a key American ally in the Horn of Africa. The price for this alliance was the Cagnew Station, a massive U.S. military communications and spy base in what is now Eritrea. For decades, it was one of the most important intelligence gathering posts for the U.S. military, listening in on Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, and the Middle East. In exchange for hosting this base, Selassie's regime received hundreds of millions of dollars in U.S. military and economic aid. This support was crucial for maintaining his authority over a feudal, multi-ethnic empire rife with internal tensions. However, it also tied Ethiopia's fate to American foreign policy and made his autocratic regime a target for leftist, anti-imperialist opposition at home. The very aid that kept him in power also fueled the revolutionary sentiment that would eventually lead to his overthrow in 1974. Haile Selassie's case is different from many others on this list. His motivation was arguably the preservation of his nation, not personal enrichment. Yet the deals he struck demonstrate the difficult choices African leaders faced. To maintain independence and gain the tools of modernity, he had to cede a degree of sovereignty, allowing a foreign power to operate a major military installation on his soil. It was a strategic sale of access and alignment, a compromise that ultimately couldn't save his ancient throne from the forces of history. We arrive at number 1 on our list, and it's a grim one. Charles Taylor of Liberia. Taylor wasn't just a corrupt politician. He was a warlord who ignited and profited from some of West Africa's most brutal conflicts. His rise to power and his presidency were funded by the sale of a nation's soul, not just its resources. He started a civil war in Liberia in 1989, a conflict that became infamous for its brutality and its use of child soldiers. How did he fund his war machine? Through blood diamonds. Taylor gained control of diamond-rich areas in Liberia and, more notoriously, provided weapons and support to the brutal RUF rebels in neighboring Sierra Leone in exchange for a steady supply of diamonds. These gems, mined by enslaved civilians under horrific conditions, were then sold on the international market, with the profits used to buy more guns, fueling a cycle of unimaginable violence that engulfed 2 nations. Taylor's dealings weren't limited to diamonds. He also granted logging concessions to foreign companies, allowing them to clear-cut Liberia's pristine rainforests. The revenue from this logs of war trade also went directly to funding his regime and his military escapades. He essentially turned Liberia into a criminal enterprise, where every national asset, from minerals to timber, was liquidated to finance his personal power and regional ambitions. He had a chillingly accurate campaign slogan when he ran for president in 1997. He killed my ma, he killed my PA, but I will vote for him. People voted for him out of fear, hoping he might bring an end to the violence he himself had started. His relationships with foreign entities were purely transactional and criminal. He dealt with international arms dealers, shady business people, and even had alleged ties to foreign governments and mercenaries who saw opportunity in the chaos. He wasn't selling out his country for development or even for geopolitical alignment in the traditional sense. He was dismembering it and selling it piece by piece to the highest bidder in the global underworld to sustain a state of perpetual conflict from which he profited. Ultimately, international pressure and a renewed rebellion forced Taylor into exile in 2003. But justice eventually caught up with him. In 2012, he was convicted by the Special Court for Sierra Leone for war crimes and crimes against humanity, becoming the first former head of state to be convicted by an international tribunal since Nuremberg. Charles Taylor represents the absolute nadir, a leader who didn't just sell his country's resources, but actively sold its peace and the lives of its people for power and profit. So there you have it, 10 leaders, 10 stories of betrayal. From Cecil Rhodes drawing the blueprint for exploitation to Charles Taylor perfecting the art of the warlord president, the pattern is tragically clear. These politicians, whether colonial architects or post-colonial autocrats, traded their nation's futures for personal gain, for military hardware, or for a seat at the table of global power. The consequences have been devastating and long-lasting. Economies hollowed out, societies fractured by conflict, and a legacy of dependency and corruption that continues to challenge the continent's progress. The wealth that should have built schools, hospitals, and futures was siphoned away. This history matters. It's not just about the past, it's about understanding the present-day challenges and opportunities facing so many African nations. It explains why a continent so rich in resources can still struggle with poverty. It highlights the incredible resilience of the African people, who have endured so much and continue to strive for a better future. The biggest takeaway here is the critical, non-negotiable importance of good governance and strong, accountable leadership. A leader's first loyalty must be to their people, not to a foreign power or their own bank account. So I encourage you, don't let this video be the end of your education on this topic. Dig deeper. Read books by African authors, follow journalists and activists on the continent, and learn more about the complex, vibrant, and diverse histories of its 54 nations. Understanding the betrayals of the past is the first step towards supporting the triumphs of the future. Africa's greatest resource isn't its diamonds or its oil, it's its people, and they deserve leaders worthy of their potential. Thanks for watching.